For the past several weeks, we've been in this series called Know Thyself, and we have been talking about identity. And every week we've talked about this. I've also talked about why we're talking about identity. And this week I want to keep this on the same path. I want to keep it also very simple. Also, while I'm beginning, the ushers are going to receive the offering. So if you brought that with you, their presence down here at the front of the room means we're about to do that. And so that reminds me of it. So if you brought that with you, you can take that out. But we're talking about identity, and we're talking about it because for lots of different reasons. But one of the reasons we're talking about it is I really believe that one of the greatest gifts that is given to us in the Jesus way, like if we join the Jesus movement, one of the most significant things that we receive is a deep sense of identity. I think it's one of the questions that Jesus answers that is so significant and so important for us to answer. And it's really important because truly the questions of identity are a part of the human struggle. I mean, we wrestle with this. We wrestle with understanding who am I and where do I find my value and where do I find my meaning. And in fact, this is what's interesting about it is we wrestle with it, and at the same time, we don't broadcast it. This is a wrestling or a questioning that we seldom, we don't walk up to other people and say, would you help me understand who I am? That's just strange. That sounds like crazy talk. And yet, oftentimes, that's what we're doing. We're looking to people around us. We're looking to culture around us to define who we are. We're always saying, like, who am I? And we're trying to understand these things about ourselves. We wrestle with this, and at the same time, we don't broadcast it, and we hide it. In fact, what we actually try to do is give this image to everybody around us that we've already answered the question, right? I mean, we're always trying to resolve it and say, oh, yeah, no, I've got my stuff together. What we want people to perceive is that we've answered this, and yet lurking beneath the surface of all of these efforts and all the different things we're doing to try to present that we have it together is this deep underlying fundamental question of, like, I don't really understand where I find my value and who I am. And by the way, this begins at a pretty young age. I've shared this story in the past, but I'm going to share a side of it that maybe I haven't shared before. But when I was younger, I was born into a house of two brothers. Like, I'm one of three boys. My dad's one of three boys. My grandfather was one of 7 boys. A lot of dudes, right? A lot of guys hanging around, a lot of testosterone in my family, right? And so growing up in my house, my older brothers, they're like 5 and 6 years older than me. And so I looked up to them like most little brothers do. I looked up to them. And here's the deal. In my family, my dad played baseball. My dad was a good high school and college athlete. And one of the sports he played was baseball. In fact, I still have one of my dad's baseball gloves. And this morning I was giving him a hard time because it's like an antique now. Because it was like, I'm like, is it from like the 20s? Like, when is it? Which isn't true. But my dad played baseball, and then my brothers played baseball. And I remember one of my earliest memories as a kid, I remember going to the ballpark on 35th Avenue in Northern in Phoenix, Arizona. Today I think there's like a strip mall there. But I remember going to the ballpark there, and just my brothers would practice there, and they had games there. And I remember playing in the bleachers and getting covered with dust and watching them play. And that was some of my earliest memories, was being at my brothers' baseball games. And so naturally, as I began to look at my life and things that I would do, I assumed what? I'm going to play baseball, right? And so when the time came, I signed up for baseball, and I was looking forward to playing with my friends. I had friends that were on the team, and so joined the team and get the uniform. I was real excited about the uniform and the stirrups. Those were really interesting, strange socks, but I figured out how to put those on, did all the baseball stuff. And then I started going to practice and doing all the things that you do to be a baseball player. Little did I know, for the first year or so, I had no idea how horrible of a baseball player I was. I was horrible. Like, apparently just watching my brothers play baseball did nothing for me. So, and that didn't fix my ability to swing a bat or catch a ball or throw or anything like that. So I'm playing baseball, and I remember there was this one day that the realization came of how bad I was. But we showed up at a game, and the other team, they were short a player. And so in order for the game to count, they had to have an extra player. And so rather than forfeit the game, my coach recommended that he offer one of his players to the other team. And that was me. And so I'm like literally trotting across, like, oh, I got new friends over here, like I'm going to go play with. And so I get over there. It's like the 5th inning when the clue phone rings, and I finally realize, you don't give your best player away, do you? There was like this internal struggle going on too. Like, do I strike out on purpose? No, I strike out no matter what. That's basically it. I was just a warm body. And so this is the truth. So that's the moment. I remember sitting there that moment. I remember realizing, like, I don't want to play baseball. Then, here I am. It's 4th grade. I remember this is what came after that. There was this tension that started to rise up inside of me. Because I didn't know how to tell my brothers or my dad that I didn't want to play baseball. Because it was an identity thing, right? I mean, if you're in my house, you play baseball. We just play baseball. It's part of life. We're going to do it. And now I don't, like, who am I? If I don't play baseball, what am I going to do? So here I'm a fourth grade kid wrestling with questions about identity, wrestling with whether or not I'm going to be a baseball player or not. I remember this one particular day sitting in the car, and the tension was so thick, it was rising up inside of me. And I remember just, like, I didn't want to let my parents down. So finally, I remember sitting in the car, and I said, guys, I don't think I want to play baseball anymore. They were so relieved. It was like, oh, like there was like the joy returned to our house. It was like, oh, thank God. Like, do anything but play baseball. Do you know how bad you are? I'm like, no, I know how bad I am. Like, a very honest moment, right? But here's the deal. It isn't just kids that wrestle with this. I mean, here's basically how it goes, is we kind of move through life, bouncing from thing to thing, looking for some sense of identity. Like, what am I? And we all want this label to wear. We all want to be a part of a team. We all want some way of describing ourselves. And so we do this for security. We want some sense of security, something to stand on, like, okay, I kind of know who I am, so I'm a ball player, or whatever it is. I'm a business person. I'm an architect, whatever it is. I'm a mom, I'm a dad, I'm a whatever. You know, we have these labels that we want to put on. We want those for some sense of security, or we want it for recognition. So we chase these things, maybe so we don't have to answer the questions that people are asking. You know, like, hey, who are you? Well, I identified with this group, and because I've identified with it, well, this is who I am. And so the story's already being told. I'm letting the group tell my story for me. And so we join a group, kind of hoping for that recognition, that acknowledgement, maybe that inclusion. You get a little further on in life, and you start to wake up to the fact that there are people in the world that are doing like meaningful things. And then you start wondering, am I? You know, you start seeing people that are living lives of significance, and you start wondering, am I living a life of significance? Like, when I'm done, like, taking in oxygen and blowing out carbon dioxide, when those days come to an end, will I have mattered for anything? Will I have counted for anything? And so this search sort of continues on. We keep moving, looking for some way to resolve the questions we have around identity, which is why I come back to over and over again this amazing gift that Jesus has given us, because something happens when we join this Jesus movement, when we become a part of what he's doing. Something happens that changes our identity, and it gives us something that extends beyond all of these things we pursue. Because eventually these things fail us, right? I mean, and eventually there's a team you don't make, or there's a team you make and you find out you're not the best or the fastest player on the team. Eventually there's a job that you don't get because somebody was there longer, not because they're better, but because they were there longer, they got the job. Eventually there's somebody that you love that either fails you or walks out or just lets you down. Eventually these things happen. Eventually the education doesn't pay off. I mean, eventually all the difference, we can buy the house, and we can shine up the cars, and we can parade the kids out in front of the picket fence, and we can take the beautiful family picture. And even then you do all those things, and there can be this deep sense of, I still haven't resolved this thing in my heart. So what Jesus gives us, this gift that he's giving us of a deep sense of identity, this thing we've been talking about week after week, it is so important and so beautiful and so critical, because beneath the surface of us looking like we have it together is this deep question: who am I? So the early church, this early Christians in the first century, they had a sense of identity. They had titles, they had names, they had descriptions. It didn't matter if you were a mom or a dad or a student or a teacher or a construction worker. It didn't matter whatever you did. It didn't matter if you were male or female. It didn't matter if you were black or white. It didn't matter if you were slave or free or Greek or Jew. They had these titles. It didn't matter if you were sick or you were healthy or you were tall or you were short. It did not matter. If you were young or you're old, you could be these things. You could be a disciple. Didn't matter. All this other stuff could go away. It didn't matter. You could be a disciple. You could be a son or daughter. You could be an heir. You could be a temple of the Holy Spirit. You could be a follower of the way. It's a possibility. That's what he gives us. These descriptions, they shape and reform our understanding of ourselves. And they carry us through these moments. So today we're going to look at another one. I know some of you want this to be over, but we're going to look at a couple of more. And today we're going to look at the one that is probably the most common. Anyone want to take a guess what it is? Christian. Yeah, we're going to talk about being a Christian, which is a really interesting term because there's so many perceptions in our culture in particular on Christian. In fact, this week I was reading different things. I read one author said, I know a lot of Jesus-y people who aren't Christians. I know a lot of Christians who aren't very Jesus-y. Ouch. Right? I mean, that's common in our culture today. I know a lot of people who are Jesus-y, and I know a lot of Christians who aren't Jesus. Like, that's an amazing indictment. Well, how is that even possible? Is that possible? Is that maybe even a representation of a misunderstanding of the word Christian and where it comes from? I remember years ago there was a song that came out. I love this song. Every time it plays on the radio, I crank it up, sing at the top of my lungs. Mark Cohn, anyone know the Mark Cohn song, Walking in Memphis? You know that song? All the people that were born around my time, yeah, I'm walking in Memphis. You know, like I love that song. You know, you're just like rocking out, like it's this soaring piano jamming song. Some of you have no idea what I'm talking about, but that's okay. But then there's this last part of the song that has always captured my attention. And by the way, this song, it's written about a true experience for him. He grew up culturally Jewish in New York City, and he went to Memphis, and he was a part of the music scene for a little bit. He got so caught up in the gospel music scene that's the heart behind that song. That's the story that's going on behind it. So there's this one part at the end of the song where he says this. It says, and they asked me if I would do a little number, and I sang with all my might, and she said, tell me, are you a Christian child? And he said, ma'am, I am tonight. I've always loved that, right? It's just like, this guy's so caught up in the moment. He's like, are you a Christian? I am tonight, right? Because I can be a Christian tonight. Maybe not tomorrow, but tonight. This experience is so exhilarating. I think I'm going to be a Christian for at least 24 more hours. Is that possible? Is that possible? I mean, what does this word mean, Christian? What does it mean to be a Christian? There's an op-ed writer for the New York Times named Nicholas Kristof. And over the past several years, he writes all sorts of different topics, but there's this one repeating theme. The title of the articles, the title of the editorial is, Am I a Christian? And he meets with or interviews various significant Christian individuals in America. So for example, he met with a cardinal from New York City. Jimmy Carter was one of his interviewees. Timothy Keller was another one. He meets with them, and he at some point shares some of his views around Christianity, although he calls himself a Christian, but then he'll ask them, am I a Christian? Based on what you believe, based on what you know to be true about Jesus, am I a Christian? Now, the articles are really interesting. They're sort of fascinating the way they go, and in some ways they take us in a direction we're not going to go today. But the heart of what he's saying is somewhat similar to what we're looking at today. He's asking them, based on what you know of me, would you call me a Christian? It's a good question. Based on what you believe, based on how you live, based on how would I answer this question, are you a Christian? Today I want to answer this a little more deeply. I want to answer what it means, where it came from, the origin of this word, so that we understand it better. If it's the most common word, if there's misunderstanding around it, maybe we should understand it a little more clearly. So I want to talk about it for a second. First of all, let me just mention this. This is like a little known fact, a little Cliff Clavin moment here. Little known fact is that the word Christian only appears, as much as we use it, it only appears in the New Testament 3 times. So only 3 times are those that are members of the following of the way of Jesus, only 3 times are they called Christians. What's also fascinating is this. It is not a term they gave themselves. In fact, it's a derogatory term that was developed by those who were not a part of this movement, and they identified them as those Christians. We'll get more to the derogatory side of this in just a little bit. So only 3 times, rarely ever used, not used by those who are inside the movement, and yet today we use it and throw it around all the time. So what have we missed in this? What have we not learned in this familiarity with this word Christian? What do we not know? First place we see it is in the book of Acts. Acts chapter 11, first time we ever have in recorded history the word Christian actually being applied to a group of people. And let me give you the background of this. The early church, just so everyone kind of knows church history a little bit, the early church starts in the city of Jerusalem. That's where the crucifixion of Jesus takes place, his resurrection. That's where the church is birthed, and it's primarily birthed, Christianity is birthed as a sect of Judaism. So it is like a part of Judaism. Now, this sect obviously teaches something very different in the sense of the burden being light on people. It kind of reduces the law. It changes things. And so there is opposition to this growing church in the city of Jerusalem. Those that were significantly religious were not appreciating the liberal nature of what Jesus was presenting. And so in their views, this was allowing people to just live freely and without any consequence towards God. And so they started to persecute these early Christians. Now the persecution grows so significantly that eventually there's a diaspora, there's a scattering of the people of the early church. And so this church that you read about in Acts 2 that grew to the thousands, now everyone gets scattered over the Roman Empire. So a little pocket of them lands in this city called Antioch. Now, Antioch is a city that is a trade city. It is multicultural. It is modern. It is this amazing place of commerce. And there's this group of Christians that go there, and they begin to tell people about the way of Jesus, and more people start to join in. So at some point, the disciples, they hear this. The apostles hear this, and they're like, hey, we better send somebody there. There's like a movement happening. Like, we should go and help these people kind of figure out what it really means to be a part of this movement. And so Barnabas goes to Tarsus looking for Saul, who we also know as Paul. He goes looking for him, and they're going to go. And that's what we pick up with. That's where the story sort of begins. In Acts chapter 11, in verse 25, it says this. So Barnabas went to Tarsus to look for Saul, and when he had found him, he brought him to Antioch. And for a whole year, they met with the church and taught a great many people. Let me just pause there for a second. So for a year, so they get there, and for a year, they are saying, hey, this is what it looks like to now love your neighbor. This is what it looks like to understand who you are, to have your heart and your identity shaped by the gospel. This is the way you now use your resources and live in community. This is the way you live towards the others that are around you. This is the way you work for peace and justice in your city. So for an entire year, Paul and Barnabas are teaching these people. And then we read this next sentence that says, and in Antioch, the disciples were first called Christians. So this term arises out of whatever these guys are teaching. Whatever's happening, whatever's taking place in these lives, it now arises, and they are called Christians in this place because of this work. So what's happening here? What's happening? The significance is incredible. Antioch. As I mentioned, it's a metropolitan city. It's a modern city. It's a multicultural city. In fact, it's not even, I wouldn't even say, it's multinational. It is multi-ethnic. It is multinational. And the city of Antioch was designed in a very particular way. In fact, at the center of the city was the marketplace, the economy. It's all about the economy, right? So the economy is at the center of the city of Antioch. And so people would come and they would descend on the marketplace every day, and they would do their business, and they would interact with one another, and they would conduct all the different business they had to do in a day, and then they would retreat back into their neighborhoods where they lived. Here's the thing about Antioch that was really interesting. The city was built with walls, and those walls were like pieces of a pie. They were like slivers. And those pieces of the pie, those walls, those slivers, they contained within them each individual ethnic group or nationality that lived in the city. And so every nationality, every group of people, they had their own neighborhood. They had their own enclave. And so the rhythm of life in Antioch would be that you would wake up in the morning and you would go to the marketplace and you would do your business. You would interact with people. You would have this sort of miniature multicultural experience. And then you would retreat back into your neighborhood and you would do life with the people who looked like you and talked like you and believed like you and felt like you, and parented like you, go on and on, that's the list, liked the same sports that you liked, all those different things, you would retreat back into this place. And so there's this rhythm, Antioch, people going back into their neighborhoods and then coming back to interact around the economy, and then back into their neighborhoods and back to the economy. A few years ago, some individuals got together and took the U.S. Census data, and they made a map of the United States based on ethnic origin or immigration patterns, where people come from, and they put a dot on the map for every single person, and it represented where they came from, their racial background, their ethnic background. So I zoomed in, took a little picture of the version of this of New York City, and this is what it looks like. So every time I hear about Antioch, I think about this. I see that it still exists. I see that we still seem to come back to our neighborhoods. And maybe we interact in the marketplace, but we come back to the neighborhood and we live in this place. So here's what happens in Antioch. Christians show up. The gospel arrives. And there is a new way of living towards the other. And the church, these people who are following Jesus, they begin to break down the dividing walls. Not the physical dividing walls, but the cultural dividing walls that existed in the city. They begin to break these down. They begin to live towards each other in a way that nobody had ever lived towards each other. They were crossing the lines. There was no reason for these people to come together except for Jesus. They would come together for the economy, maybe just for a business transaction, but now they are doing life together, and they are loving each other, and they are caring for each other, and they're understanding each other, and they're listening to each other. There is a life that is taking place among these people that is distinct and different. These people are living towards each other in a beautiful way. And the culture did not know how to label them, because every culture has labels, right? I mean, you got jocks, and you got geeks, and you got hicks, and you got hipsters, right? And you got, some of you are like, what's a hipster? Just ask the one sitting next to you. You've got people that are educated and uneducated. We have all these, we have these kind of labels that we start putting on. We have the haves and the have-nots. We do these things, right? It's based on what you wear, based on what you drive, based on where you live. We start putting labels on people. We start labeling them, right? You have all sorts of labels. You have black, you have white. You have labels that exist. And now there's a group of people, and while the labels still seem to exist in the culture, they don't define the group of people anymore. They aren't defined by what they're wearing or what they're driving or where they're living. They're not even gathering around those things. Now they are gathering together. And what happened in Antioch is so powerful that those who are looking from the outside said, we don't know what to call you. You look like this. You sound like this, but you're not. You like, we can't figure you out. Like, who are you? By the way you are living, it's a different kind of culture. And what we discover about the word Christian from this first story where it's used is that Christian is a category of identity that is beyond the categories of culture. Like, we have all these categories, all these things we put on, all these ways that we want to be perceived. And then Christian, this word, this category, is something that is beyond those things. It is different than those things. It transcends those things. Now, before you get really excited, you also need to remember it was derogatory. This was a slam. Oh, you Christians. In fact, the IANs, the Christians, that IAN you add to Christ, basically it means you're of the party of Christ. So like in our culture, it would mean this. People would walk up and say, you Republican, you Democrat, you Libertarian, you Green Party, which one are you? And you're like, you don't answer. And they're like, what are you? Oh, you're the party of Christ. And so it became this sort of sarcastic thing. Oh, you're not Republican or Democrat or Libertarian or Green Party. You're one of those people. You're one of those Christians, the party of Jesus. It frustrated people. They didn't fit the categories. They didn't fit the categories, and so it was this conundrum for them. This is interesting, this whole idea of people not fitting the categories. In our culture, Christian has become a category, and not always a positive one, right? So we need to acknowledge this, that the word Christian, the title Christian in our culture needs to be redeemed. Because for many people, it is not a positive label in their mind. In the same way it was derogatory then, it's derogatory today. Here's an example. InterVarsity, which does a lot of on-campus ministry on college campuses across the U.S., they've done some study on the intellectual or philosophical movement of an individual as they become a follower of Jesus. Like, what are the significant steps? What are the things that happen along that way? There's also an individual with the last name of Ridley that did this in the 70s. Same thing, looking at the intellectual stages a person moves through in becoming a Christ follower. And one of the most significant things that both studies have revealed is that the most significant step for a person living in our culture today, like today, living in America, one of the most important things is that they have a friendship with a Christian. They finally have a trusted friend who is a Jesus follower. But the characteristic of this is that in every case, they discovered that this person is not like other Christians. How many of you have heard that before? You know, you're not like other Christians. Thank you? I don't know how to respond to that. One author says this about it. He says, basically, the step is identified by this. They finally have a friend who's a Christian that they don't think is an idiot. Because the message they've been hearing all the time is, oh, Christians are sort of ignorant. They don't know it. And so finally they meet somebody, and they're outside of the category. Wait, where do you fit in this? Wait, you're intelligent, and you're smart, and you're loving, and you're not hypocritical, and you're not judgmental, and you follow Jesus? Yeah, go figure, right? So this term emerges in such a derogatory place in Antioch and in our culture, and yet there's something about it saying you don't fit the categories that it also defines. In Antioch, it emerges. People see them, and they go, you're one of those. We observe this inside of you. Now, why do they observe this? What's happening? Kind of help us understand that. The second place that we see it used is in 1 Peter chapter 4, the second place we're going to look at least this morning. 2 Peter chapter 4, verse 14. Peter is again, he's writing the church, and he's encouraging people like us, people who are trying to be a part of this Jesus movement. He's saying, hey, let me help you along the way here. And he writes this in verse 14 of 1 Peter 4. He says, and again, you hear the derogatory tone of this. He says, listen, if you are insulted for the name of Christ, which what would the insult be? you're being called a Christian. So if you're being insulted, if someone's calling you a Christian, you're blessed because the Spirit of glory and of God rests upon you. But let none of you suffer as a murderer or a thief or an evildoer or as a meddler. Yet if anyone suffers as a Christian, if that's what you get called, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God in that name. Now you see maybe why this got popularized, right? Because he's taking this, he's spinning it. He's saying, I know it's derogatory. I know they're calling you a Christian. I know it's not a compliment, but do you understand what they're saying? Do you see what's going on? They're observing something in you. You don't fit. You don't fit, but it's because you're blessed. There's something happening. And what is happening? The Spirit of God is at work in your life. That's exactly what he's talking about here. The reason you don't fit is that, as we talked about last week, you have become a temple of the Holy Spirit. You have become a conduit of the mission of God, and his power and his presence is now upon you. And what does that mean? That means that everything is changing around you. You are changing as a person. When we read the New Testament, it talks about people having fruit in their lives, that there's the fruit of the Spirit in Galatians. And basically what that means is that we end up becoming more loving and patient and kind and gentle and good and self-controlled. There's something happening. The life of the Spirit is shaping me and moving me. And now people begin to see this. He says, don't be ashamed of this. When they call you a Christian, they're acknowledging the work of God in your life. You are actually changing because God's Spirit is in you. God's Spirit gives us gifts and abilities. And so now people who formerly didn't have the capacity to influence, people who didn't have the gift of teaching until they began to follow Jesus, suddenly they do. These gifts are taking place. Things are happening. People are speaking prophetically into others' lives. They're being filled with God's Spirit. The Spirit of God is changing them and moving in them and using them. And so he says, when this derogatory term gets thrown out, would you embrace it? Would you embrace it? Because what it says is that God is at work in you. And what we discover is that this word Christian, it is this expression, it's an external observation of what's happening inside of a person. And it's an external observation of this internal transformation that is taking place inside of us. This term is speaking to something. If you are a Christian, it should be observed because you're different. So if you're Nicholas Kristof and you're sitting across from a former president and you say, am I a Christian? It shouldn't be that hard to answer. Right? Christian is this observable thing that's taking place inside of us. Now, Peter says, hey, when this happens, you're going to receive ridicule. Why? Because suddenly we stop playing by the rules. When you begin to lean into the identity we have in Christ, you start leaning away from the identity that this world is trying to place on us. And when you stop caring about those labels, and when you stop caring about those concerns, when you stop worrying about how people are going to think about you, they tend to respond with jealousy and strife. Why? Because you're getting what they're looking for. Because you're finding what they've been chasing. And he says, would you rather be known for being a murderer or a liar? It's a pretty good thing to be known for. You are a person in whom the Spirit of God is moving. By the way, this persecution comes from both sides. It's not just people in society, but if you notice in the story of the early church, it's also religious people, which leads us to the last story, the last example of where this term is used. There's religious people who are persecuting Saul or Paul. Acts chapter 26, kind of the third and final example I want to look at, the third and only example that we have left to look at. There's only three. But the Apostle Paul, he's arrested. So after Antioch, he goes on, he continues, and he starts these missionary journeys. He's talking about Jesus everywhere. Eventually, he gets himself in some hot water with the religious people, and he finds himself in court. And the court situation is incredibly complicated because there's a Roman ruling party or Roman government that's over the region of Jerusalem. And then there are also individuals who are propped up by the Roman government that are Jews that are actually ruling in that place. And so you have governors, and you have kings, and you have all this convoluted stuff. And so in this final moment, he's standing before all of these people, and he's expressing his testimony before them. And in verse 24 of Acts 26, we read this. It says, as he was saying these things in his defense, Festus, who is the governor of this region, Festus said with a loud voice, Paul, you're out of your mind. Your great learning is driving you out of your mind. Love that. And Paul said to him, I'm not out of my mind, most excellent Festus. I like that. Most excellent Festus. But I am speaking true and rational words. And then he turns his attention to the king. King Agrippa is this Jewish individual who would have grown up in a Jewish home with a Jewish background, Jewish education. He's sitting here, and he turns his attention. He says, "For the king knows about these things, and to him I speak boldly. For I am persuaded that none of these things has escaped his notice, for this has not been done in a corner. King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? I know you believe." And Agrippa said to Paul, "In a short time, would you persuade me to be a Christian?" And Paul said, "Whether short or long, I would to God that not only you, but also all who hear me this day might become such as I, except for these chains." I love this last part. Would you persuade me to be a Christian? Paul's attention to Agrippa, his statement to him is a statement that I believe is made to all of us who know some things about Jesus. Paul says, you know these things. You know these things. You know these things, and what you need is not more information. You don't need to understand more. What you need to do is trust what you already know. He's looking at Agrippa, and he's saying, you know. What you and I need is not more information. What we need is to lean in to what we already know to be true. Paul continues on. He says, listen, this isn't just for you. This is for everyone. My hope is that everyone would experience this. And what we discover is that Christian is an image that we are being persuaded to bear. We're being persuaded to bear this image, to wear this reputation. He's persuading us. He's saying, don't you already know these things? We know these things. Will you allow the title Christian to fall on you? And will you not be ashamed of it? And in order for this to be true, in order for these things to be lived, we have to abandon our other identities. Christian is an identity that is gained by abandoning all other identities. The way you and I become labeled Christian is when the pursuit of our identity is no longer in all of the other pursuits of our culture, but it's in our pursuit of Jesus. That's when we become labeled with this word. That doesn't mean we stop working and going to school. It doesn't mean that we stop interacting with our neighbors and doing all the things. It doesn't mean we don't buy a car the rest of our lives. It doesn't mean those things. It simply means that from now on, moving forward, I have replaced my quest for identity in those things with my identity in Jesus Christ. And Agrippa's struggle and him looking and saying, what, are you really calling me to be a Christian? Like, think about what I've worked for. Think about my position. Think about the authority that I have. Think about all the material good. Come on, man, I've run the race. I've gotten this far. Are you really asking? Are you really contending that I become this? And the question is, why wouldn't you? I mean, what's on the other side? That's the question we ask, right? What's on the other side? What if I give up? What if suddenly all of these things... See, we have been given a pattern. We've all been told we're going to play baseball, right? We've all thought, well, isn't this just the way it works? Weren't we all born into a family where it just kind of goes this way, and you do these things, and you get this job, and you marry this person, you do this, and we've all played this game. You kind of follow the map. And there's this fear that says, I've been telling myself this all my life, and what happens if I don't do this? What's on the other side of that? What's on the other side of a decision that says I'm no longer going to find my identity, my purpose, my meaning in those things? What's on the other side is a promise from the only person ever in the history of the world to give his life for yours. See, Jesus over and over again, what does he say? He says, anyone who wishes to save his life will lose it, but anyone who loses his life for my sake and the gospel will find it. Who will you trust? Will you trust the messages of culture and believe that that's where we're going to find identity? Or will you lean into the only person who has ever done enough to make that promise come true? If you lose your life for my sake, you'll find it. I know it's awkward. I know. But on the other side, there's life. It's why Paul can look in that room and say, not just you, Agrippa, but every one of you. If you knew what I knew, apart from these chains, you would want exactly what I have. You know, every week when I'm thinking about these subjects, there's illustrations, there's books, there's quotes, there's stuff that it kind of rolls through my mind. And this week, as I was thinking about this one, there was one book that came to mind, and I can't shake it, and I'm embarrassed to admit it. But it's the story of the ugly duckling. How many of you have heard the story of the ugly duckling? All week long, I was just like, the ugly duckling, the ugly duckling. You know, those of you that haven't read it, if there is such a thing, the story is about a swan that's born into the family of a duck. And all the swan wants is to be a duck. and his family tells him he should be a duck. It's not until he discovers that he's a swan that he realizes how beautiful he is. Could it be that what God has created us for is this title Christian, but we have been forced into a family of ducks? We have been created swans, but we have been forced into a family of ducks, and we are trying to live by these rules. And the beauty of who you are and the beauty of who you can become is discovered when we finally recognize and embrace the label that is truly us, Christian. Amen? Would you stand with me? May you, ugly ducklings, no longer suffer mistaken identity. May you know who you are in Christ. May you walk confidently. And may people see and observe what the Spirit of God is doing in and around you. Amen? Amen. Amen.